Hello, historians! We are going to be looking at the War of 1812 today, which is Notes 4 in your Unit 2 packet. You can go ahead and find the page that looks like this, and I will let you know when we need to flip to the second page. Yes, it's a two-pager. Let's get started. The background story to this war is that Britain and France had been fighting with each other for about 50 years on and off, and in 1803 the leader of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, was really on a quest to take over all of Europe, and Britain was trying to stop them. Britain had the world's most powerful navy at the time and a very strong army, but Napoleon was very determined. Some other background about the lead up to this war of 1812 is that the British are still a little bit irritated with the United States since we won our independence in 1781. We were a lost colony for them, so that means they lost some of the money that they had put into colonizing the region and the taxes that they were able to collect from the people living here. At the time, Britain still owned all of Canada and wanted to reclaim some of the lands in the interior part of North America, specifically to get access to the Mississippi River. Also at the time, the United States economy relied on trading goods with both France and Britain. Of course, they were at war with one another, so they didn't want us to be trading with each other. The first three presidents of the United States had to do some negotiating to try to remain neutral and isolationist, but under James Madison, the first president to ever declare war, we had our first war. All right, so some of the causes, go ahead and find this set of graphics in your notes. Some of the causes of the war then are that the U.S., who didn't stop trading with France, was being attacked by British ships. Our merchant ships were being attacked as we headed to France to do trading with them. Those ships were being attacked in both the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes. The British Navy was the most powerful navy in the world at the time. Also, the British were kidnapping U.S. sailors. This is a term known as impressment, which has nothing to do with impressing anybody. It simply means that the British would stop a merchant ship, they would climb aboard, and they would kidnap those people they claimed to be British, and they would force them into their navy. Another cause of the war, and this was kind of the last straw for Americans, was that as settlers were moving into the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys, many Native American tribes were being pushed off their lands, and they wanted to fight back. The U.S. discovered that the British were providing those Native American tribes with weapons. And so that made many Americans angry. On the British perspective, they were hoping that by helping the Native Americans, it would scare off the American settlers, and then ultimately it would give British control of that interior part of the continent. We can't talk about this time period without talking about an incredibly important Native American leader of the time. His name is Tecumseh, and he was a Shawnee chief, who very wisely realized that the Native Americans would be stronger if the different tribes would work together. So he and his brother, Prophet, worked together to bring tribes together and work together as a confederacy. That confederacy attacked some American settlements on Tippecanoe Creek, which is in the state of Indiana, in November of 1811, and the leader of that state, the governor, William Henry Harrison, organized a militia to fight back. So in your timeline, which is on the second page of the War of 1812 notes, you can go ahead and fill in that the British helped the Indians fight the U.S. at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Now, as some Americans started to call for war, there were other Americans who said absolutely not. So we have the two groups, the isolationists, represented by the dove, and the war hawks being represented by the hawk. Isolationists, for the most part, were people who were involved in the shipping business, whether they were sailors or they were businessmen. They wanted to keep trading with Britain and knew that a war would put an end to that, at least temporarily. They also, some of them felt that the odds were against the United States because it was a brand new country. It had a very small navy at the time in comparison to the British Navy, which was the biggest in the world. On the other hand, warhawks said, we can do this. We need to do this because we need to make the frontier safe for U.S. settlers, and we need to maybe add Canada to the United States. Also, they thought we need to stand up for our merchant ships, for our sailors, and protect our shipping rights. So it's with this in mind that President James Madison had to make a decision on whether to go ahead and ask Congress to declare war, which he did, knowing that we did have a smaller navy, but that the British were also fighting against France, so their forces would be divided. So if there was a time to fight, it was now. So he's the first president to declare war by going to Congress and having them vote, and that was in 1812, which goes in your timeline. All right, so the next couple of slides, we're going to just look at the battles at sea. This is on the same side of your notes as the timeline. So the battles at sea were really for the most part, happened in the first year and a half of the war. There were about 40. They took place on both the Atlantic and in the Great Lakes between the United States and Canada. The U.S. saw a few victories, but even with Britain dividing their military fighting force when they were fighting against France, U.S. difficulties were pretty difficult and rare. So at the beginning of the war, it did look like, at least at sea, the British were taking the upper hand. In terms of the frontier, so that area in the Northwest Territory where Michigan and Ohio currently are, we thought that we'd pretty easily be able to march into Canada and take that colony away from the British, but we were wrong. Every time we tried to invade Canada, the British would push us back. Certainly, it helped the British that many Native Americans fought on the side of the British, maybe thinking that if the British won, they would grant them their tribal lands. And the British did, at least at the beginning, look like they were going to be the one to win. An important note here is that Chief Tecumseh, that Shawnee chief that brought the tribes together in a confederacy, died while fighting on the side of the British in 1813. Finally, we're going to talk about a few battles on land, including one where the British invaded Washington, D.C., a brand new little city that had been developed when the Constitution was created as the capital of our nation. When the British invaded, they were able to burn the Capitol building and the brand new White House. President Madison and his wife Dolly were inside at the time and had to flee for their lives. At this time, the British were done fighting against the French, so they were able to turn all of their attention on America. So they started to see some more victories. The Battle of Fort McHenry is an important victory on part of the Americans towards the end of the war. The British were trying to come in from the Atlantic Ocean to attack our forts on our coastlines, and they were attacking Fort McHenry, which was in Baltimore, trying to take over that fort and get a little foothold onto the land there. And during that battle, a gentleman named Francis Scott Key was watching, and all night long he heard the battle, couldn't quite see what was happening, and when the sun came up, he saw that the American flag was still flying over the fort, and that meant the Americans had held on. And that inspired him so much, he ended up writing a poem, which has become today's national anthem for the United States, the Star-Spangled Banner. And someday, if you have the chance, you can go to Washington, D.C. and see the Star-Spangled Banner for yourself. They kept the flag from Fort McHenry, and they have it on exhibit at the Smithsonian. All right, let's go ahead and wrap up this war. In 1814, there were some defeats on the part of the British, and news was sent back to the leaders of Britain to let them know that things weren't going well. And with the lag in communication time, the British, they couldn't always keep up with what was happening on a day-by-day basis. The information they were getting was often weeks old. But in 1814, both sides really were ready for the war to be over. And so in a city called Ghent, which is in current-day Belgium, the United States sat down with the British and agreed to a peace treaty to formally end the war. Neither side could really claim victory, so we could kind of consider this one a tie. So in 1814 on your timeline, go ahead and write that the Treaty of Ghent ended the war. So neither side was winning victory where the other side was surrendering, and instead of prolonging the war, they just decided to end it. All right. Ironically, the biggest victory for the United States came after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. And this happened, of course, because of the communication lag time, which could be weeks for the information of that treaty signing to get to the United States. So before the news of that peace treaty arrived, General Andrew Jackson and a ragtag army of militia and free African Americans and Indians and pirates defended the port city of New Orleans, and they won an incredible victory, killing or wounding about 2,000 British, compared to only about 20 Americans. So very important victory for America, even though it happened after the war was officially over. Finally, the effects of the war, feelings of loyalty and patriotism surged. Before this war, many Americans didn't really feel American. They had more loyalty to their state than the country. But after this war, their feelings of patriotism really rose up. Also, the Native American resistance was weakened because with Tecumseh's death, no Native American leader really stepped into his place to bring those tribes together. So we see that weakening, which is bad for them. Good for the United States, but bad for the Native Americans. And finally, in terms of industry, the United States learned to produce things that they weren't able to make before the war, or just really hadn't made for themselves because they were able to get the products from France or from Britain. But during the war, when the trade with Britain was cut off, we were able to kind of force ourselves to learn how to make some of those products. All right, that's it for now. Have a wonderful day, historians.